start. Let's go. So pleasant good day, everyone. We're looking at lab 13, the respiratory system. So we'll talk around the topic for a little bit, and then we'll reinforce our knowledge on the concepts by looking at some multiple choice questions from our website, which I think are particularly pertinent. So let's have a go. So how does air move from the outside environment to the lungs? Well, you know, for the last couple of weeks, what have we been looking at? Well, the prior two labs, we looked at blood. Last day, we looked at the heart and blood vessels. So today's a new one, respiratory system. And does the blood have anything to do with the respiratory system? Anybody? Does the blood play any part? Is there a relationship between the two?
Yeah, yes, I believe so.
What do you think is the relationship?
Yes.
How do you have that relationship?
I want to believe that the transportation of oxygen.
Yeah, correct. It's right. Both oxygen and CO2, right, are transported by the blood. So it's very important. Then when we look at the respiratory system, that is a means of actually getting air into our system. More specifically, not only getting the air, which is referred to as external ventilation in terms of the exchange of air between the lungs and the blood. Then you have internal ventilation or internal respiration. That's the exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the blood and the tissues themselves. So oftentimes you might hear those terms, external and internal respiration. External referring to the exchange of air between the external environment, i.e. in the alveoli and the blood, and internal respiration referring to the exchange of air between the blood and the tissues. And the mechanism by which the air moves is by diffusion, simple diffusion. So there is no energy involved, no ATP involved in the movement of this air from the external environment to the internal environment. Now, why do you think there is no ATP involved? Don't overthink this for a very simple reason. Why do you think there's no ATP involved in moving that air from the external environment to the tissues themselves? Why do you think so? Think about the body as a business and see if you could explain why there's no ATP that is used. And think about ATP like money. So see if you could paint a picture for me. Well, one of the simple things is it would be very expensive if you had to utilize ATP all the time you're breathing in. Geez and ages. I mean, virtually all of the ATP which you produce would go into just bringing the air in, bringing the air. So you wouldn't have ATP to do anything else. So by all means, for all intentions, you just be saying down, making ATP, and that same ATP you're making as fast as you can make it, using that to bring in air. So, so one of the great things in terms of what the body has done is that the machine, it has developed a system of bringing in air from the external to the internal environment. And it does so by moving it down concentration gradients. And a simple movement of air or liquids from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. What is that process known as? Moving it from high to low. It begins with D.
Diffusion.
Thanks, Shalomie. Yeah, diffusion. So air, in terms of the movement of air, it's just by simple diffusion, looking at concentration gradients. So that means the concentration of O2 in inspired air is higher than that which exists in the blood. So therefore, it just moves by simple diffusion from at the level of the alveoli. So first it diffuses into the surfactant, which is around the alveoli, around the entire lung. It diffuses from the surfactant into the alveoli. Sorry, the other way around. it moves from the alveoli, sorry, into the surfactant, and then from the surfactant, it diffuses across and gets into the blood itself. Once it gets into the blood, it then moves to the particular tissue areas. You have this same difference in concentration, higher concentration of oxygen in the blood as it relates to that which exists in the tissues. So therefore, the oxygen just moves by concentration gradient. It moves from the blood, the red blood corpuscles, hemoglobin, attached to the oxygen, it releases it, and it just moves or flows into the cell just down a concentration gradient. So that is very important to note and remember in terms of this movement of air from area of high concentration to area of low. And that's how it moves from when we breathe in to when we breathe out. When you breathe out, the reverse happens. CO2, which is now at a higher level in the cell, the CO2, now what happens to the CO2? The CO2 moves from the cell to the blood, and it moves down its concentration gradient. So a high concentration in the tissue, low concentration in the blood. So diffusion occurs of the CO2 into the blood. Once it gets into the blood, it could either dissolve and form carbonic acid, a very weak acid, dissolved in the blood, or what it could do as well, it could attach itself to the hemoglobin. All right, so this is how carbon dioxide is carried in the blood. Then it goes, and once it reaches the level of the lungs, you have diffusion occurring now, diffusion from the blood itself into the alveoli. And then, of course, you breathe out, and now you have expiration. So it's a very interesting concept to appreciate in terms of that movement of air into and out of the lungs and into and out of the blood itself. All right, how gas pressures influence how gases move. Let's have a look and see how gas pressures are involved. Well, when we look at gas pressures, we have to think about partial pressure. And in terms of definition, partial pressure is the pressure of a single type of gas in a mixture of gases. All right, so if you think about it like this, if you have a pilau, right, a pilau of gases, as it were. Imagine you take a pilau and you just vaporize it. You have some machine that could just turn it into a vapor. Poof. So what kind of gases would you have, from a pilau? What kind of gas then? If you could vaporize a pilau, what kind of gases would you have? Well, you'll have a chicken, if it's a chicken pilau, you'll have a chicken gas, you have a pigeon peas gas, you'll have a rice gas, whatever ingredient that you put in that pilau, that will contribute to the overall pressure of the gas itself. And the same thing that happens when you think about partial pressure and the gases in the atmosphere being composed of really a mixture, the gas, with that which we breathe in. What we breathe in is not just pure oxygen, but instead is a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen, plus some other ones, other gases. But the two major ones, which for our intents and purposes are important, is oxygen and nitrogen. So if we were to think about it this way, based on this partial pressures, if we were to measure the pressure due to oxygen, so if you were then just to look at oxygen alone, partial pressure would be like 159. Partial pressure of nitrogen, let's say, is 593. So the total partial pressures due to both oxygen and nitrogen would be represented by the sum of these two pressures. So in other words, the total pressure will be 752 millimeters of mercury. And this taps into Dalton's law, right? So Dalton's law, which describe the behavior of non-reactive gases in a mixture, says that a gas type exerts its own pressure. That's the total pressure exerted by a mixture is the sum of the partial pressures. So therefore, this phenomena is due to Dalton's law. Do we specifically have to quote Dalton's law for biological purposes? Absolutely not. It's just good to appreciate the rationale behind this whole concept of partial pressures. Now, let's have a little move down. So in terms of gas exchange, this is what we were talking about earlier. Internal and external respiration. External respiration, it just refers to the movement of air from the alveolus to the red blood cell and vice versa from the blood cell back into the alveolus. This will be CO2 going back into the alveolus. So over here is the lung. Over here would be the capillary. Remember, capillaries are nothing more than approximately 0.29 micrometers in diameter. These things are really small. And virtually, here it is showing a red blood cell passing through a capillary. So what happens when we do breathe in, the pressure or the partial pressure of oxygen here, it's higher than that which exists in the blood. So the oxygen moves down its concentration gradient from the area of higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. So it moves into the blood that flows in the capillary. In the capillary now, the blood in the capillary, it has these red blood cells. And these red blood cells are like magnets, oxygen magnets. Once it sees oxygen, it takes it up, right? And it forms oxyhemoglobin. So now the oxygen is carried in the blood itself. The reverse happens when we're breathing out. After it gives off its oxygen, when it reaches the area of the tissues, tissues will have a relatively lower concentration of CO2. Now, why would the tissue have a lower concentration of CO2? What does the tissue do with oxygen? Anybody can tell me, what does the tissue do with oxygen? So, it gets it, the cells, when you're looking at the cell, so of course, tissues are made up of cells. So when the cells get the oxygen, what do they do? What do they use that oxygen for? Anybody? So this is an important concept. When all it is, that oxygen, in fact, why do we breathe in oxygen? If I were to ask you that, what this whole, yes, we live and we know to live, we have to breathe and so on. But why do we breathe in oxygen? You ever thought about that? Can't we just go through life not breathing at all? Wouldn't that just be cool? Why do we have to constantly, breathe in oxygen and give off CO2, breathe in oxygen? Why do we need to do that? Well, the oxygen is used to break down food. That is a critical thing. So yes, we take in food, and food is broken down into different components. We have proteins, we have fats, we have carbohydrates, which are really complex sugars. And then the oxygen, the oxygen is used to break down this food. So oxygen plus one of the simple components of food, sugar, gives you what? Carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And that energy now is used to run everything in our body. So the key thing in taking in oxygen is that we use that oxygen to break down food. And when we break down the food, as a waste product, carbon dioxide is produced. Now we have to get rid of that carbon dioxide, and the reverse happens in terms of the movement of oxygen from the external environment to the lungs, to the alveoli, diffusing into the capillaries, into the blood taking it to the tissues composed of cells taking that oxygen to break down food. It keeps using oxygen. So therefore the concentration of oxygen will fall. And as it falls now, you have a concentration, as it falls, the concentration of CO2 keeps going up because that's produced as a waste product when you break down food. So now the CO2 concentration in the cell is high relative to the blood. So therefore CO2 moves into the blood by simple diffusion. And the reverse happens. The blood goes back to the capillaries. When it reaches the capillaries, it diffuses across the membrane, and then it gets into the alveoli, from the alveoli into the bronchioles, bronchioles to the bronchi, bronchi to the trachea, and then we breathe it out. We good? All right. So external refers to the movement of the air, particularly oxygen and carbon dioxide, from the alveoli into the red blood cells, and from the red blood cells back into the alveoli, the CO2. So oxygen moves from the alveoli into the blood, CO2 moves from the blood into the alveoli and into the external environment. Internal respiration refers to the movement of oxygen from the blood into the tissues. And then, of course, movement of CO2 from the tissues back into the blood. That is known as internal respiration. All right, let's see if we could ask some questions now, and let's see if we could get them out. All right, you ready to do some questions? All right, question one, what do you think the answer is? Remember, one of the things, just feel freely to speak. If ever you hear me laughing at anything you say, I will give you $100 for lunch because I should know better. And sometimes one of the things in science, some of the most profound discoveries actually came from persons, who came up, who were thinking differently. So, don't ever be afraid to say what is on, as it relates to what you think. Right? And as I said, if I do laugh at you, or if I chuckle or anything like that, I will give you $100 for lunch. Okay, let's go. Gas moves from an area of what partial pressure to an area of what? How do gases move? If you're looking at diffusion, from, so which
high to
one?
low.
So which one do you think it is? This one or this one? This one?
That's one.
High to low.
Right. How sure you are about it?
Very
Maybe.
sure.
Very okay. And you're right. Well done. Well done. Right. So it moves, and same thing for partial pressures. It moves from high to low. And that is how oxygen, for instance, when you breathe it in, at the level of the alveoli, the partial pressure. So, it comes just like when you vaporize the pill, woof, you turn it into a vapor. So the pressure, so you have different parts to it. You'll have a chicken pressure, you have a rice pressure, right? You have a pigeon peas pressure. And all of these contribute to the overall pill pressure. Same thing when you're looking at these gases. You have oxygen, nitrogen, their individual pressures contribute to the overall pressure of the gas itself. And in this case, always remember diffusion, things move from high to low. And why do they move from high to low? Well, it's just an energy requirement. It's a lot easier to move from high to low than low to high. Very good. Let's look at another one. When ventilation is not sufficient, which of the following occurs? Well, this is actually not on the syllabus for us, but let's see if we could figure it out. Ventilation, so in other words, the movement of the oxygen, what you're bringing into your lungs is not enough. The amount that is going to your blood is not enough. What would happen? Any idea? You remember we have a maybe as well. So if you had to use maybe, which answer you would say? Anyone? Which one you'd say? All right, you say bronchial dilate, okay. You're not too sure, that is incorrect. Capillaries constrict, maybe. That is correct. So the capillaries, when ventilation is not sufficient, which of the following occurs, and when the capillaries constrict, what it does, it causes the blood cells less and less to be aligned at the level of the alveolus. So you have a more efficient movement of oxygen in. So in other words, yeah.
So this is the same as vascularization. So like if it doesn't have enough vascularization, this is like when it have like low levels of carbon dioxide, it would affect the alveoli or something like that, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. I don't know if you could say that different. I'm trying to fully
Right.
understand. If you could say it a different way. Yes.
Okay, I was asking, right? I was reading and I came across a question stating that in the blood of somebody that have low carbon dioxide, it causes them to be dizzy. So I'm just asking if this would same apply for that, the constriction of the capillaries, because the blood flows into the capillaries to be able to supply the alveoli. So I just want to figure out if it's the same thing.
Oh, just say it again. I just got lost for a second there. You were reading that. Just say the same thing again, if you don't mind, please.
No, don't bother.
No, not at all. No, I think it's very important. Just say it again, if you would.
I was asking
Yes.
if the supply of carbon dioxide and oxygen affects the capillaries to cause it to constrict.
Oh, okay. Okay. And the answer is okay. Now, it doesn't affect the capillaries, but what it affects, you have respiratory centers and you have sensors in your body that actually detect changes in carbon dioxide and oxygen. And as a result, that leads to the constriction. So in other words, the capillaries themselves is not the detecting they don't detect the changes, but you have the respiratory center, as well as you have these sensors throughout your body, as well as in the kidney, that actually detect changes in CO2 levels. So to answer your question, yeah, you're quite right. Changes in CO2 levels, when they are detected in the blood, it ultimately the signals are passed along to the respiratory center, and it does cause change in the volumes, let's say at the level of the capillaries, yes. You do have either vasodilation and vasoconstriction, which increases the volume or restricts the volume of blood, and at the level of the capillary, it causes it either to dilate or to constrict. So you're quite right, yes, but the capillaries don't detect it. You have sensors in the body that detect changes in CO2 concentration and oxygen concentration. And in fact, when it's very extreme, you have erythropoietin being given off, erythropoietin. Erythropoietin, what does that do? Well, erythropoietin acts at the level of the bone marrow, causing red blood cells to be made. So this happens in particular when, let's say, you go to very high altitudes. The higher up you go, you have lower concentrations of oxygen. And the body, these sensors in your body detect the fact that right now, I'm not getting sufficient oxygen. So what does it do? It secretes erythropoietin. Erythropoietin causes the red blood cell, the stem cells present in your bone marrow to actually start to make more red blood cells. So therefore the carrying capacity or the ability to absorb oxygen from the limited amount that is present in what you're breathing in, that increases. So yeah, so that's a very good question that you asked there. That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it. Okay, great. Let's go on. Gas exchange that this one, I like it. Let me hear somebody now. Gas exchange that occurs at the level of the tissues is called what? Remember, we have two. We have one exchange that occurs from where? From the alveoli or the lungs, from the lungs to the blood. Then we have another one from the blood to the tissues, and vice versa, from the tissues to the blood. So the one at the level of the tissues, what is that one called?
Is that interpulmonary respiration?
Okay, so we have interpulmonary respiration. How sure you are? Maybe, probably, or definitely. Okay, so maybe
Yeah,
you're not too
maybe.
sure. Okay, you're incorrect. You were very close. Not interpulmonary, but
Internal respiration.
internal. How sure you are? Maybe, probably, or definitely. You're definitely correct. So you had the inter part right. So I am mad at you. You got, in your mind, you had the concept there. It just chose the wrong stem. So you were halfway there. So internal respiration, quite right. I like it. So thanks for the first person. You were thinking correctly. You knew it was inter something. All right. And then the second person reinforced it there. Let's look at another one. Yeah, we don't need this one. The partial pressure of CO2 is 45 in the blood and 40 in the alveoli. What happens to the carbon dioxide? Let me ask this question. It's 45 in the blood and 40 in the alveoli. So the alveoli, there's in the lungs. Think about this as the lungs. So in the lungs is 40 and it's 45, and in the blood is 45. Lungs is 40. How would it move? How would the carbon dioxide move? Or what would happen?
Into the blood.
It always moves. How do things move? From low to high or high to low?
It diffuses into the blood.
Right? It always moves from high to low. So since CO2 in the blood is 45 and in the lungs is 40, it will move from, it should move.
From the blood to the alveoli.
From the blood.
Diffuse into the alveoli.
Let's see. Probably correct. Yeah. So it diffuses into the, whenever or if ever you see a question like this, always remember all you have to do is get the numbers straight. Whichever one is the higher one, it will move from that area to the other one, high to low. Remember, I used to have a store in Trinidad called Hilo. And then it turned into what? What Hilo turned into?
Massy.
There you go. Massy stores, right? So that's it. Okay, great. Very good. Let's go. Let's go to the next page and see what's going on. All right, so the transport of gases, let's speak. So how is oxygen actually carried in the blood? You know, so you have this hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is nothing more than a heme. It's a protein, heme, connected to what? Globin attached to the heme moiety. Heme refers to the iron. So you have this hemoglobin is nothing more than a protein, and these little discs here represent iron. One of the things which is really important to appreciate in the body is always the relationship between structure and function. What would happen if you change the structure is you would change the functionality or what it does. Red blood cells, what do? Well, they transport oxygen in the blood. So what would happen, do you think, if you change the structure of a red blood cell? What do you think will happen to its function then? Would it still be able to carry oxygen? What do you think?
So kinda.
Kind of, I hear you. But definitely the carrying would be affected in some way, form or fashion, right? That's what you're intimating to, and you're quite right. So structure and function. If you do change the structure, you will change the function. So very simply, iron. Persons who are anemic, what is their story? What do they really lack in their diet? Persons who are anemic.
Iron.
Iron. And the reason why, you know, and I don't know if you've ever seen anybody or if you yourself ever had anemia, but you know, you feel weak and you know, you only want to lie down and sleep and so on. And the reason is because literally you're not carrying oxygen throughout your body. And remember, for that energy to move around and to smile and to tell everybody, morning, morning, everybody, that energy comes from ATP. And that ATP comes when you break down food at the level of the cell. So if it is now the things that are carrying the oxygen, this hemoglobin, doesn't have iron attached to it, structure and function. The structure, how it actually folds, how it looks, it changes. And it doesn't look quite right, such that it cannot pick up oxygen. Therefore, the carrying capacity of oxygen is affected. And therefore, you feel weak. You can't carry the oxygen and you feel weak. However, to rectify the situation when somebody is showing signs of anemia, you just increase the iron. Now the iron could come back in, and with the iron present, it refolds again into the correct shape. Now is able to take up oxygen. And that's why in terms of persons who are anemic, it's very important. Well, just increase the amount of iron, either from your diet or taking tablets directly. Yeah? Okay. So as oxygen, 1 erythrocyte contain 4 iron, right, carrying up to 4 molecules of oxygen. So each erythrocyte, 1, 2, 3, 4. Very important.
So excuse, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
See, now we're talking about hemo and blood.
Mm-hmm.
You could give it a brief insight too, because it was saying the shape, right? When the
Yes.
cell shape, like sickle cell patients,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how it's sickle shape, it also affects their oxygen.
Yes, most
too.
definitely. That's a very good point. Yeah. And one of the problems with persons who have sickle cell, not only is it painful because of the sickle shape cell now forming, especially as it moving through capillaries, my understanding is quite painful, or you do have accumulation at joints, and therefore you have blockages, so that movement now brings about pain, but it also lessens the carrying capacity of oxygen in the blood. So persons who would have sickle cell, the oxygen carrying capacity would be reduced in their body, most definitely. That's a good, lovely question. Let's see if we could.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah, let's see if we could have a look at that. I spell sickle, you know. Right, so if you notice here, sickle cell disease patients experience hypoxia or low oxygen level in tissues. Bottom line, they do, right? So for them, they'll need, as they say, yeah, they have to do oxygen therapy. So one of the things that help them, they have to increase the level of oxygen either. So those persons, I myself have never known someone with sickle cell. I don't know if having like an oxygen exchanger or having something to that effect would actually help them. All right. But definitely you do have their level, they experience hypoxia, which is low concentration of oxygen in their blood. Okay, good. So the function of hemoglobin, as mentioned here. So when you look at the red blood cell, oxygen is carried to the blood by specialized transport which relies on the red blood cell. It's a protein, hemoglobin, metalloprotein, which is a protein with a metal, and metal is iron, which bind the oxygen. Heme is the portion that contains, so heme, and the globin is the protein. All right, heme is the iron part. Good. All right, oxygen dissociation, running the hemoglobin of the fetus. Ooh, this is particularly interesting. I just want to touch on mention one thing. Now, question, in terms of when you're looking, and you look more at this when we get into like almost the last couple of weeks of class, when you look at reproduction, does the maternal and fetal blood, does it normally mix? Or is the fetal circulation separate from the maternal circulation? And by extension, is the fetal blood type then different to the maternal? What would you say?
So I would say different only
Yeah.
in delivery.
Correct. You hit the nail on the head. That's the only time. Or if it is you have some type of blunt trauma that occurs, during the pregnancy, if the mother falls, and let's say you have rupturing of the membrane, you could have blood mixing in situations like that. And as quite rightly said, during the delivery process itself. But normally it's two separate, totally separate. You only have the movement of gases and liquids by diffusion, but you don't have the mixing of blood at all. Right? Normally, the only time, as I mentioned, is if you do get a trauma, and you have rupturing of capillaries or something to that nature, then you'll get mixing. But normally, no, separate. Everything is separate. Now, I just want to point out one thing as it relates to hemoglobin of the fetus. Just this part here, fetus hemoglobin, it has a very great great affinity for oxygen. Excuse me, just one second. Yes, hello? Yeah, back on track. Got a little frog in my throat. Just want to point out, fetus hemoglobin, it has a greater affinity than maternal. It has this very strong affinity for oxygen. So that's just the one take-home message there. And let's have a look at the questions and let's see how that would go. Now, oxyhemoglobin forms a chemical reaction between which of the following? So which one do you think? Oxyhemoglobin. Remember, no wrong answers. Always remember that. It's just what you think. Yeah, what you think might be correct, right? But go ahead.
Hemoglobin and oxygen.
Let's have a. How sure you are?
Definitely.
Let's have a look. And you are correct. Yeah. Hence the name oxyhemoglobin, as the name implies, oxygen attaches to hemoglobin, and that's a chemical reaction. Very good. Let's have another one. Which one of the following affects it? Well, all of these things, but you'd look more into this when you're looking at reproduction. Chloride shift, not on the syllabus. All right, there is not on the syllabus. You don't have to worry about that. Well, I think I want to say is the ball, probably is the Haldane, probably Haldane effect. Okay, that is all as it relates to this. The oxyhemoglobin was the take home from this one. Let's go again. Hypnea and they just, let's see what the increased ventilation that results in an increase in blood pH. What is that called? Not on the syllabus. Hyperventilation, it increases. Exercise can trigger symptoms. Not on it. Let's go back to some of the other things. Now, a dog, everybody like the little doggies. You ever wondered how a dog could smell something, when it pick up a trail? How it does it? I don't know. We have any dog lovers here who could answer that question? No. Well, I never thought about it. And actually just, in my reading, I recognize this fact. The dogs actually have slits on the side of their nose, so that when it is they pick up a scent, what they do, they could breathe out of the side of their nose, so that when they're taking in the air, they're sniffing, it doesn't interfere with the fact that they're tracking a scent. So in other words, when tracking a scent, the slits open, blocking the front of the nostrils, and they could still detect the scent, as they put it on, and they're sniffing, and they breathe not through the nostril. So in other words, you don't have a dilution then of the smell they're picking up. I thought that was rather interesting. Maybe not, but let's go. Let's do a couple more questions. So respiratory systems, they're not on the syllabus. We just have to focus on our own mammalian system. When we think about our system, what do we have? We have the nasal cavity, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx. This is the pharynx here, nasal, of course, the back, oro is the back of the oral cavity. Then we have the larynx, or the voice box. Come down to the trachea, we have bifurcation into the primary bronchus, secondary bronchus, tertiary, bronchioles, and then the terminal bronchioles. Very important to note, if you were to look at this bronchial tree, where is the only part that you have the exchange of oxygen getting into the blood? What is the only part if you're looking at the entire, out of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what is the one place, one and only place where oxygen gets into the blood by diffusion? There's only one place it happens. Where is that?
Pulmonary vein.
Well, the pulmonary vein, you're partially right. The pulmonary vein, it does carry oxygenated blood, right? That pulmonary, returning it to the heart itself. Yeah.
Is it the alveoli?
Yes. I was just speaking. The person who answered previously, you were referring it in terms of the movement of the oxygenated blood. So you were correct in that regard. The pulmonary vein does carry the oxygenated blood, returning it to the heart itself. I was just referring it, I wasn't too clear, so the fault is on my part. I was referring it to the lung itself. So at the level of the lung, the only part it exists is at the alveolar sacs, right? And the alveolar sacs, as you see here, is very bumpy. He showed that the sac consists of these alveoli, it's like a bunch of chenet, or like a bunch of piwa, right? Or a bunch of, what else bunch up does look like this? Anybody? Okay, you get the picture. But the only place, and here you have the capillaries crisscrossing the alveolus. And it's at this level, you have the movement of oxygen from the alveolus across the membrane into the capillaries. And the reason why that is that the capillaries are 1 cell thick. They are very thin, as you mentioned, 0.29 millimeters, micrometers in diameter. So they're very, very small. And they also have spaces between them. The cells are not tightly packed, so that the air could literally squeeze between the spaces and get into the blood in that way. So it diffuses from the alveoli into the capillary, and that's how it gets into it, and it moves along. Now it goes, in terms of the network, blood network, it could go throughout the entire body carrying oxygen. Okay? And here, one of the things, in terms of the trachea or the trachea is kept open. How? Is it always open, or does it go flat? So in other words, when you lie down on your back or you lie down on your belly, does your trachea fold
It's
down,
always
close down
open.
like a, yes? It is always open. How? What
Always open. Like
adaptation? What does it have to always keep it
the
open?
rings,
What are those rings made of? Something that begins with C.
cartilage.
Thank you very much. Well done. So the cartilaginous, the rings of cartilage, they keep the trachea open at all times. And that will be particularly important when we go to bed. Would it be a problem if you go to bed if this fell flat? Yeah, you wouldn't be able to take in oxygen. So again, body, the machine, the marvelous invention that it is, consists of these rings, cartilaginous rings that actually keep the trachea open all the time. Very good. Lungs, left and right lungs. Which lung is larger, left or right lung? And why? Which one is larger, left or right?
The right.
So is it right?
Right
Right,
lung, you're
because it have
correct. No, you're correct.
It's three
Three lobes. You're quite right.
Yes,
Thank you
in the
very much.
middle.
Right?
sections, and the left have two.
Correct. So the right lung has an upper, middle, and a lower lobe, whereas the left lung only has an upper and a lower. Why is it the left lung is smaller? It's due to the presence of something right here in the mediastinum that we looked at last class.
Heart.
The heart.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well done. So the presence of the heart, which lies right here in the mediastinum with the apex pointing to the left, as you well know, that causes the left lung to be smaller. And in fact, this consists of two lobes, upper lobe and a lower lobe, whereas the right lung, it's big man, right? 1, 2, 3. Could you live with one lung?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and in fact, if we were to look, for those of us of the Catholic faith, the leader of the Catholic faith, Pope Francis, yeah, since he was a teenager, right? During his senior years, he had an infection and antibiotics wasn't too big back then. So they removed a significant portion of his lung. So for all intents and purposes, he has one lung. And in fact, he's now well into his 70s, and he had that, let's be generous and say he had it at 20 years old. I mean, he's been living over 50 years with one lung. All that being said, yeah, you could live, you could live with just one lung. And that is the reason, in fact, why you have one lung, why you have two lungs. So you have two lungs just in case something go wrong. So this process, and you see it happening in the body, where you have two of a same thing, or you have an organ where the cells do the same thing over and over and over, like the liver, the hepatocytes. All of them do the same thing. So you ask yourself, why does the liver, all the cells do the same thing? Well, that is because if you get damage to your liver, either through cirrhosis, for those of us who do have the affliction of alcoholism, let's say, you could function on half of a liver because all of them do the same thing. So, of course, it wouldn't be right now 100%, right? But as more and more the liver gets damaged, the output of the others will increase. But you could lose up to half of a liver and you'll still function, which is why when you hear somebody has cirrhosis to the point that their liver isn't working, man, they're really badly off. I mean, more than half of the liver gone, not functioning, right? So always think about that. And that's why your liver is like that. So we see similarly with your lungs, you have a backup. So your body, the machine, has this capability, or in terms of the design, has redundancy, something called redundancy. It has redundancy built in. Redundancy at the level of the cells for the lungs, all of them do the same thing. Sorry, liver, they all do the same thing. Redundancy at the level of the organ itself. You have two lungs. Could you think of any other structure in your body that has two of the same thing, where you have this redundancy?
The kidneys?
The kidneys, thank you very much. The kidneys, they have two kidneys for that same reason. And one more up here is enclosed in the skull. What organ is that one?
So can you repeat the question, please?
So, which organ is encased in your skull? And you have two of them. Well, two of the major parts of it. What do you have in your skull? Thank you, your brain. Thank
Your
you very
eye?
much. Your eyes as well. Thank you very much. Yeah. Not only does it give depth perception, but in case something goes wrong, because we are visual persons, so we rely significantly on our eyes. And one might argue that's why the area responsible for visual processing is to the back of our heads in the occipital lobe. Because of the fact it's so important, so and we walk forward in the event that you get a blow to the front, if the area of processing visual information was right here, well, you'd lose it right away. So maybe in terms of design, your body in its wisdom, the visual processing sensor is all the way to the back, the occipital lobe, right? A little superior to the level of the neck, right? That little bulge, in the back of your head, that's where so visual signals have to go right across your head, all the way to the back, and then they're sent back, they're sent to the to be processed in the cerebral hemispheres. So maybe that's an adaptation because of the fact we have visual creatures, yeah? But the brain, we have two cerebral hemispheres in the brain. You look more at that, well, actually would have looked at that partially when you looked at neurons in SNF1, but you have two hemispheres. And interestingly enough, before the age of 13, and one time they used to do this, persons who had seizures a lot, babies and children, before they reached the age of like 12, they used to perform this operation called a hemispherectomy. And literally what they would do is take out part of the brain where the seizures were occurring. And this is the incredible thing. The other half of the brain would take up the functions that, of the part that was removed. Absolutely incredible, right? So they used to perform the hemispherectomy. They don't do it anymore. So maybe that knowledge, maybe there was the risk of death or other things happening was too great. But all that being said, it just shows the amazing ability of the body, the human body, and particularly the brain. If you do get the damage and you're having seizures and so on, you can remove part of that lobe and the other part picks up those functions. Absolutely incredible. I kid you not. Okay. All right. So this is showing you your lungs and so on. Let's have a look at the other one. Let's look at this question now. Organism that, okay, we don't need this one. Directly across the membrane. Nope, less than 1 millimeter. So we didn't know that one. We don't need this one. We don't look at animals, right? Okay, this one. Once air enters the lungs, it is diverted into which one? The bronchi, the alveoli, or the bronchioles? So when it now enters the lungs, what's the first thing it runs into?
The bronchi.
Right, so the bronchi, which is the plural of bronchus, right? So the bronchi, and then the bronchi becomes the bronchioles. And then the bronchioles, they divide, and then you get the terminal bronchiole, on the end you have those sacs. So the answer here would be bronchi. How sure? How sure you are? Very sure. Quite right, right? Well done. Let's go to the next one. Let's just have so gas exchange, we mentioned that, high to low, movement of that air. And these are some, in terms of these definitions, usually you'll only get these in multiple choice question, inspiratory reserve and so on. Let's see if we could say the inspiratory reserve volume measures the amount of air, which does not explain why pressure in the lung is external, and the total lung capacity. So these are just formula which you have, the total lung capacity is residual, expiratory, tidal, and inspiratory. Yeah, so those are just ones which you have to learn the definitions. Now, let's have a look at this air. This is showing the partial pressure of the different gases as you take them in. So when you're now on the outside, so when you're looking at the composition of, let's say, oxygen, it's high, 160 millimeters. So the pressure of oxygen in air, ambient air, is 160, whereas carbon dioxide is 0.2. When you breathe it in, it goes in trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, lungs, terminal bronchioles, alveoli, now across the capillaries. From there, it gets into the blood. In the blood, let's look at the concentration in vein. There's any veins. So this is the blood that's returning to the heart. We notice the CO2 is higher than the oxygen, whereas in arterial blood, we notice the oxygen is higher than the CO2, which is what is expected, because now the arterial blood, this blood has now picked up oxygen and is now getting back to the left atria, ventricle, aorta, into the systemic circulation. So take home from this: one, when you're looking at oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations, it is very high in the external, normal air. Two, in the arteries, oxygen concentration is higher than CO2. And in the veins, the CO2, the partial pressure of CO2 is higher than that of oxygen. Right, that's the take-home message. The point is that PCO2 should be pointing over here and PO2 should be pointing here. All right, let's see if we could do some questions. All right, in order for oxygen to enter the bloodstream, blood must have what? So for it to go from the alveoli into the capillaries, what needs to happen? Well, it's diffusion, right? So in order for oxygen to enter the bloodstream, the blood must have what?
If it's diffusion, moving from high to low, so it has to have very high partial pressure.
Very high partial pressure. All right. How sure you are?
Just a guess.
Okay. Well, the thing is very high, but you didn't specify what is really lower oxygen level in order for oxygen to enter the bloodstream. That means it's moving from the lungs to the blood. Remember, it moves down a concentration gradient. So yeah, lower oxygen levels than the air in the lungs. The blood, so in the blood, the oxygen concentration has to be lower because remember, it's moving from the alveoli, which is the air in the lungs, into the blood. Moving from high to low, concentration in the lungs has to be high so that it can move down that concentration gradient and get into the blood. Right? So in the blood, it has to be lower oxygen levels than the air in the lungs. So it can move from the area of high concentration, area of low concentration. Just 1 second, please. Hello? We there? Hello?
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
let's look at another one. Partial pressures dictates the something during respiration.
So the efficiency of gaseous section.
The rate, the partial pressure will dictate the rate of gas exchange. Knowing the difference, now we do know the gases move from the area of high concentration to low. Once that difference is great, that will I didn't want to use the word interfere, but that would dictate the rate or the speed. If you have a big difference between the partial pressure, let's say, of the oxygen in the lungs as compared to the blood, it will move in very quickly, as opposed if they were close. So in terms of numbers, when we say close, if you're looking at 7 and 10, those are close, as opposed to 10 and 30, those are far away. So if you had it, 10 and 30, where the concentration of oxygen is 30, and that in the blood is 10, it will move rapidly, which is why when somebody, let's say, goes to the hospital and, you know, their oxygen concentration, saturation levels, when you use the what is it called, the oximeter, or, you know, the little clip they could put on your finger, I think it's the oximeter it's called, yeah. That measure the oxygen saturation in your blood. If they realize the oxygen is low, what would they do? Well, they take a tank and, you know, they put the tube, well, if it's very low, they put the oxygen feed directly into your nose, so that high concentration of oxygen you're breathing and getting into your lungs, that causes the movement into your blood very quickly, and that will increase the oxygen in your blood very rapidly. So you're breathing in then pure oxygen in that regard. Okay. What is the ratio of carbon dioxide production to oxygen consumption called? This is not on the on our syllabus, right? The RQ, respiratory quotient, not needed. This is the last of the questions we're going to look at here. So breathing, no, we don't have to look at animals. It's only humans we're concerned about. Now, how does air move in and out of the lungs? In essence, it is sucked in. It is sucked into the lungs. And what muscles are important for the air being sucked in, according to Boyle's law? Well, you have this major muscle here.
Diaphragm.
Thank you very much, the diaphragm. And you also have intercostal muscles, which occur between the ribs. And what happens when you breathe in? The diaphragm moves, it gets flattened. So it changes from this dome shape and it goes flat, as shown here. Well, it goes down, not really shown here. But the diaphragm moves downward and it gets flat. I like to call the diaphragm the guts pusher down a muscle, because what it does, it pushes the guts down, and in so doing, it creates more space. And what happened with the intercostals push your chest up and pushes the rib cage, out and up, and that increases the volume. Now, in one of the things with Boyle's law is an interesting correlation between volume and pressure. And what it says is that volume is inversely proportional to pressure. What does that mean? Always think about volume and pressure on a seesaw, right? Everybody remember the boy or girl days? So a seesaw, let's see if we can have, I can't tell you when last I saw a seesaw, right? So if you look at a seesaw, right? Everybody familiar with these? Well, it depends, because you don't really see them now, so it's old school. Let's look at this seesaw here. So Boyle's law, what Boyle's law is saying is that pressure and volume are inversely proportional. What does that mean? Think about this relationship. You have a seesaw, volume over here, and you have pressure on this side, right? So V and P. What would happen when this goes? Now remember, P is on the right side, P is on the right side. When P goes up, what happens to volume?
Goes down.
It goes down. And over here, when you're explaining, and we'll get back to the other diagram shortly. Whenever you're explaining it, always explain it from the perspective of volume. You're starting explaining with volume. So in this case, when volume goes down, what happens to pressure? When volume
Pressure rises.
Pressure rises, good. And when volume goes up, what happens to pressure?
It goes down.
Right. And that's all you need to know about Boyle's law. Volume goes up. Always think about it like a seesaw. So if the volume goes up, pressure goes down. When volume goes down, pressure goes up. Now, how does that relate to Boyle's law? Let's see. When we breathe in, diaphragm goes down, it flattens, the guts push down a muscle, it pushes down your guts, right? So it increases the volume of the lungs. The intercostal move up and out, increasing the volume. So overall, the volume of your lung goes up. So when the volume goes up, what happens to the pressure in the lung? Based on that seesaw, when the volume of your lung increases, what happens to the pressure?
It goes down.
It goes down, yeah. So the pressure in your lungs goes down compared to the external, the pressure outside. as it relates to diffusion and partial pressures, how do things move? From an area of high pressure to low or low pressure to high? How do things move?
High to low.
High, low, just like the grocery that the grocery formerly known as, no, well, massive would be the grocery formerly known as high, low, right? So it always moves from high to low. In here, the pressure is low, outside it is high. So how you think air would move? Moves from its area of high pressure to low, and the air moves into your lungs. Now the reverse, that's when you breathe in. Now when you breathe out, what happens? Well, the diaphragm goes back to its normal dome shape. The intercostals relax, so the chest flattens, the rib cage goes in, chest flattens. What happens to the volume of your lung?
It's increased.
No, the volume, look at it, compared to this one. Remember, you're looking at the overall volume. So the diaphragm goes up, remember the guts push down, huh? It goes up, and this pushes down. If you were to look at this area here, compared to this one, which one has a larger volume? Which one is smaller?
B.
Right, B. So what happens when you breathe out? The diaphragm goes back to its dome shape. The intercostals relax. Your chest falls. The ribs cage, goes in. The volume goes down. Let's think about the seesaw. When the volume goes down, what happens to the pressure?
It goes
Let's go
down.
back. When the volume goes down, what happens to the pressure?
It goes down.
Pressure rises. Very good. So the pressure in your lungs goes up compared to the external pressure, which is lower. How do things move? From the area of high pressure to the area of low pressure. So the air is actually sucked out of your lungs. So in other words, this whole notion of your diaphragm and your intercostals is really facilitating the movement of the air being sucked in and out of your lungs. It moves by pressure differential, by the change in pressure. And that's how air moves out of your lungs. It's literally sucked out. Suck out. Suck out. We good? You want me to go through it one more time? We good? Okay. So always remember when you're explaining it, volume, always start from the perspective of volume. All right? Always start from volume. And remember, the diaphragm is the guts pusher down a muscle. It pushes down when you breathe in, increasing the volume. That and the movement of the intercostals increase the volume. Volume and pressure inversely. When volume goes up, the pressure in your lung is low. Compared to outside, things move from high to low, air moves in. When you breathe out, what happens? The diaphragm goes into the dome position. Your intercostals relax. It brings back in your chest, and this causes the lungs to come into this smaller volume. So the volume goes down. What happens when you think about the seesaw? When the volume goes down, pressure goes up. So you have a high pressure compared to the outside. How do things move? From the area of high pressure to low. So it moves from into your lungs outside, and the air is sucked out of your lungs. And that's how you blow out air. All right? Blah, blah, blah. Let's have a look. Let's have a look at the questions. No, we don't need this one. Okay, movement on air, blank, lungs is a passive event, which means passive means no energy involved, no ATP. Let me hear you. Into, out of, or both in and out of the lungs doesn't require any energy.
What?
Both of them. Somebody say both of them. Is it just a guess, or is it you're sure or very sure?
I'm very sure.
Like what humans must exert muscular force to bring it. What we're talking about, diffusion, the process, right? So it's a process, but you really do have to exert muscular force to do it, to bring it into the lungs. So it's really just out of. So, but if you were talking about passive as it relates to the movement of oxygen into and out of the lungs without the need for muscles, yeah. But this one, what they're pointing to is that, well, the muscles burn energy. So in that regard, okay. Something diseases are ones in which the airways are stiff or fibrotic.
Inflammatory.
Right, they are stiff. So we have inflammatory, restrictive. So the inflammatory increase in blood flow to the area, which may result in redness and warmth, but the ones in which the airways, they're always stiff. There's restrictive ones, like cystic fibrosis, for instance. But, you know, I don't, this, after this question, I don't like the answer, you know, personally, this one. What we're looking at based okay, let's come back to that. Gas exchange is driven by which one of these? Ultimately, is diffusion. So back to the question that the other, you know, that we were looking at just now. So the exchange, that movement of the gas, it doesn't involve any energy, right? In terms of how it moves out of the alveoli, the level of the alveoli into the blood. And then from the blood into the tissue, that is by straight diffusion. But the movement of the gas from inside to outside, the whole process what we spoke about in terms of increasing the level of the capacity of your lungs, that involves, of course, movement because the muscles have to contract, the diaphragm and the intercostals. So that involves energy. Whereas the movement of the gas from the alveoli into the blood itself, and then from the blood into the tissue, that doesn't involve any energy at all. These are definitions, of course. The fact that lungs never fully deflate. Right? Okay, so we'll stop here for today. I like this website. You want me to send you all this, a copy of the link?
Yes, sir.
sir.
Yes, sir.
Without hesitation, I like that. I like that. Okay, so what I will do, well, two things. Let me stop the recording first. I will send you the recording as well. Last time, stop the recording.